Good morning. I'm Rush Watson from Grace Presbyterian Church in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and I served as a ruling elder commissioner to the 224th General Assembly. The General Assembly's theme was From Lament to Hope, taken from Lamentations 5:20 through 21. The historic virtual General Assembly was held over 4 days, June 19, 20, 26, and 27. In your packet today, you will find a summary from Presbyterian Outlook of the General Assembly. It can be found on page 5 in your packet. And I would like to highlight a couple of the areas about the General Assembly. The first was the election of the co-moderators. They were elected on the first ballot. Ilona Street Stewart and Greg Bentley were elected as co-moderators for the 224th General Assembly. Street Stewart is a Native American. She's a ruling elder and is Senate exec for the Senate of Lakes and Prairies, Eagan, Minnesota. And Greg Bentley is a pastor of Fellowship Presbyterian Church in Huntsville, Alabama. Of the 3 teams standing for co-moderator, they were the only persons of color. The election was preceded by each team having a presentation, followed by questions from commissioners. Street Stewart and Bentley emphasized strong support for the Matthew 25 initiative with its commitment to congregation vitality, confronting structural racism, and eliminating systemic poverty. Presbytery, Sheppards, and Lapsley voted at its May meeting to become a Matthew 25 presbytery. The 2 selected the image of the Sokofa bird standing in the Mississippi River as a representation of their Native American and African American cultures. Street Stewart said, "We wanted people to know that we're being part of the history of the church, that we had to recognize as we move forward with whatever the church is going to be in the future. The whole idea is that we're moving forward, your feet are moving forward, to reach back and to take what was precious to allow us to take that wisdom and move forward." Their slogan is, "Learning from the past, living in the present." The Sokofa and the Mississippi River represent that slogan. It's a pictorial image of their slogan. Avoiding a floor fight on the dispute of the San Francisco Theological Seminary, Greg Bentley read a statement from the co-moderators, a joint statement saying that they would bring together representatives of the seminary and the Committee on Theological Education to resolve the issues and bring in a mediator if necessary.
I am Lou Ann Sellers, a teaching elder commissioner to General Assembly and associate pastor serving at First Presbyterian in Tuscaloosa. With a theme of lament to hope, this General Assembly was providentially poised to give voice to commissioners, experiences, and feelings in the midst of 2 pandemics, one of COVID-19 and the other pandemic of racial injustice. The GA Bible study based on Lamentations gave us language to understand the power of lament in troubled times. Composed in the aftermath of the destruction of Jerusalem, Lamentations is a dialogue of song between 2 voices, one a mourner, the other a comforter. In Lamentations 5:20, we hear the voice of the mourner cry out, "O Lord, why have you forgotten us? Why have you forsaken us these days?" And then immediately in the next verse, the voice of the comforter answers, "Restore us, O Lord, may we be restored." commissioners were asked to consider who are the mourning voices of today, and also what does the call and response between mourner and comforter, between voices of anxiety and hope today, what does this passage call us to be and to do? The answers varied. Some felt called out to cry in anger, to sing our truth in overtures and in amendments. Others felt nudged to intently listen to those mourning around them. Still others felt the voice of the Comforter was a call to action, to do something that would work towards eradicating the systems of injustice experienced, particularly by persons of color in our country. This was the nature of General Assembly, a melody of laments and hopes, working to find a path towards change. I will report on one event and action of General Assembly, which gave voice to the laments of some of the poorest in our country. This event also laid out a path towards action and hope. On June 20th, commissioners of GA were invited to take part in the digital Moral March on Washington, a march moved into the virtual world due to COVID-19. It was the vision of Presbyterian clergywoman, Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, co-chair of the sponsoring nonpartisan group, the Poor People's Campaign. Over 1 million people tuned in with me that Saturday morning to watch. I was struck by the sometimes heartbreaking testimonies of representatives of the 140 million Americans who are poor or of low wealth. Voices who mourn the fact that 60 million people earn less than a living wage in this country. Bishop Yvette Flunder, a United Church of Christ pastor in California, remembered during this march what her grandmother used to say often: "Love is not a say word, love is a do word." It was these words which captured the sentiment of the event and the marching orders I felt compelled to join. Others in the General Assembly must have felt similarly. At the next plenary of GA, the body voted to adopt the policy platform rolled out at the march. You will find the executive summary of the platform on pages 27 through 28 in your packet. As we Presbyterians grapple with how to eradicate racial injustice, this document names specific objectives towards accomplishing this task. This is one path toward action and hope. I leave you with the call to action again. Love is not a say word, love is a do word. Listen further for the other voices heard crying out at General Assembly.
Hello, everyone. My name is Patrick O'Connor, and I am a member of Emmanuel Presbyterian Church down in Montgomery, and I was very honored to represent both our Presbytery and San Francisco Theological Seminary at this year's General Assembly. One of the essential conversations that took place during the virtual assembly this year was the initial report named "On the Church in This Moment in History," that was amended and approved with the updated name "Responding to the Sin of Racism and a Call to Action." The renaming of this resolution symbolized what took place on the floor of the General Assembly around this topic. While the initial resolution attempted to address the church's complicitness in perpetuating racial injustice, it was ultimately decided that the statement needed to be more explicit in declaring Black Lives Matter and in naming the work that the church must commit to confront and dismantle systemic racism, both in the national church and in our local churches and communities. The full report is available in today's packet, which we encourage you to review and discuss with your local congregations. Unfortunately, Not included in this resolution was the work being done by the Disparity of Black Women and Girls Task Force, which Kathy will speak more about shortly. Lastly, as a student of San Francisco Theological Seminary, I was incredibly grateful for the decision by the newly elected co-moderators to seek mediation between the seminary and the Committee on Theological Education. While the conversation around SFTS's status certainly left me in lament, I still left the 224th General Assembly with hope for what our church can do as we look to the future while remembering the past, much like the Sankofa bird used by our newly elected moderators.
My name is Kathy Reed, and I serve as co-pastor at First Presbyterian in Auburn. And this year, I served as one of our Presbytery's teaching elder commissioners to General Assembly. There were more than a few moments of controversy at this year's assembly, and you may have heard about these or experienced them if you were following along. But there was one in particular that we as commissioners felt like it was important to lift up in this report. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of background. In 2018, at that General Assembly, the Social Justice Issues Committee recommended the formation of a task force that became known as the Disparities Experienced by Black Women and Girls Task Force. This task force worked over the period of 2 years to put together a report that was supposed to be presented at this year's General Assembly, but was ultimately, like a lot of important pieces of business, deferred to the next assembly scheduled for 2022. However, throughout the plenary sessions of the assembly this year, it became clear that many of the concerns raised in their report had important implications for the discussions and discernment that we were having this year. And so there was an attempt at the end of the last plenary session to introduce a statement on the ways that, and I'm quoting here, Black women and girls are disproportionately affected by the systems of white supremacy and misogynoir in communities, the church, and society at large. Now, according to our denominational polity, in order to hear this statement, the standing rules had to be suspended, which would have required, in this case, 2/3, 326 votes. However, in the end, the motion to suspend the rules only received 306 votes. Therefore, the statement was not allowed to be heard on the floor of the assembly. I received the blessing of my fellow commissioners to speak on all of our behalf to share that this was the moment of the assembly where it felt as though we went from lament to hope back to lament. In our collective opinion, it would have cost the assembly nothing to allow this statement to have been made, and in turn, it would have provided a moment of confession, repentance, and hopefully even a step toward reconciliation. When Stated Clerk J. Herbert Nelson was asked to address the concerns of the task force with prayer, these were his words for Black girls whose, and I quote, bodies and their minds and their spirits would be broken down in so many ways, and for their mothers who fall on their knees and pray for their daughters and cry for them. In your Presbytery packet today, we have included a link in the full text of the Black Women and Girls Task Force report, and we encourage you as commissioners to Presbytery to read it and to share it with your churches. This report will be presented in 2022 at the next General Assembly, and it is our hope that it will be approved and shared widely in our church.
Hi, my name is Annabelle Beavers, and I go to church at First Pres in Tuscaloosa, and I was chosen to be the Young Adult Advisory Delegate for this year's General Assembly. Although we couldn't meet in Baltimore like originally planned, there were many Zoom calls held. My first Zoom call, I was met by my fellow YADs and YAD advisors, with my advisors blaring energizers in the background, singing and dancing in many different languages, and I was a little bit overwhelmed, and I didn't know what to expect for the rest of the week. The next meetings we had were back home groups and Bible studies, and I was able to connect with young adults from all over the country that wanted to be involved within the church. The next meeting, the state of the clerk came and talked to all the yads and just wanted to check in and see how our time has been so far. He then started to talk about what the General Assembly was going to look like. He had to tell us all the parliamentary steps that had to be taken within each meeting, and he probably answered too many questions from the yads, but he wanted to make sure that we all understood what was happening and why it was happening. And so when the real General Assembly started, the yads were very quick to let their opinion to be known and stood up for what they believed was right. It was very evident that the commissioners listened to the votes of the yads because their votes almost mirrored the yads' votes. And that tells me that the youth are the church of today. They are the present and the future of the church. Thank you.
I'm Lynn Veazey. I'm with Church of the Covenant and First Presbyterian Church in Jacksonville. I am a ruling elder commissioner from the General Assembly this summer. I am coming here to talk to you a little bit about things that relate to finances. I'm here with the mite box at the church here in Jacksonville. The first thing I want to mention is a moment that came to us early in the General Assembly for an opportunity to have action on one of the commission reports. As you've probably already heard, many of the action items were deferred and moved to the next General Assembly because we were not meeting in person and it was difficult to do committee work. But one action item that was needed was a report from our Native American congregations. In 2018, at the previous General Assembly, there had been an effort to use the 2 years between 2018 and 2020 to assess the church buildings on many of our Native congregations. What they were able to do was see what repairs were needed, and there was great concern that if we waited an additional 2 years, that information would no longer be accurate and more damage would be done and needs would be greater. So we did move to have that action to submit and accept that report so that then councils and other areas of our church life could be contacted so that we could try to find funds for these efforts to provide for these congregations, often on reservations and in places with very little economic support. As part of the Native American tradition and outreach ministry from the Presbyterian Church USA over the generations, we know that there is a great need. The Presbyterian Foundation has set up an account, if that is something that you would like to give monies towards, to help with some of these much needed repairs for these congregations. The second item I want to talk about today concerns our per capita. I know per capita is one of those sensitive subjects, but it is how we fund the reality of work that we do in the Presbyterian Church USA. The good news, which sounds like good news but is a little more complicated, is that our per capita through General Assembly will not be raised significantly. The plan had been to begin staggering some rather significant increases to be more accurate to represent how we financially support this work and ministry of the Presbyterian Church. In the past, we have drawn on reserves, and as we know, both from a Presbyterian and some of our church life together, reserves become depleted, and that is what has happened at the General Assembly level. The plans, though, to increase have been set aside because the reality of this time is that many of our church bodies are finding that there will be significant decreases, both in giving and in foundational gifts that come to the church. So the GA has taken the rather dramatic step to try to decrease their budgets over the next 2 years by 20 to 25%. These are stiff restrictions, but they are trying to do whatever they can to be as financially solvent so that we can continue to do ministry into the future. For those of us in church life, we know that this time of the COVID world is different. Some of us are blessed with congregations that have rather steady streams of income even during these difficult times. Other congregations are really having a difficult time. So something to think about as we come out of this General Assembly time and move into our own church life is the reality that perhaps we need to be looking at our budgets and adjusting things not just 1 year, but maybe 2 to 3 years ahead, because it may take some time to come back up to something that we consider normal or back on the track that we were used to. Thank you.